We're going to have our first speaker before the breakout room, because we're going to use what we've just spoken about, and what our next guest, or our first guest, sorry, is going to speak to us about. So we have got the amazing Rebecca Millar, who is a very experienced book editor, specialising in commercial, so that means the big boys, crime, thriller, and suspense fiction. She loves fiction, but she also works in non-fiction. So Rebecca is here tonight to tell us more about the power of editing and making sure you have a good editor for your book. It can make all of the difference, as we know. So Rebecca, the floor is yours. Welcome to the stage. Give her a round of applause.
Well, thank you very much. Pardon? Well, first, can everyone hear me? Yes, we're good. I'm a relative Zoom newbie, so I'm not quite sure. Now I can see all your faces. Brilliant, lovely. So thank you very much to Brenda for that introduction, and to everyone, Olivia, Zara, and the whole book Brilliance team for inviting me today, as well as everyone for coming along, because that's one of the most important parts, I think, that you think about with regards to editing, because publishing, if you want to publish your book, is very much a team sport. It's exhilarating to write a book, but it is a steep learning curve, and so it's not easy. So it's paramount that you surround yourself with a supportive team. So like the lovely team at Book Brilliance, who will not only guide you and help you and hold your hand, but also provide honest feedback and the best advice tailored to your particular project, which I guess in a way, in a nutshell, covers the role of an editor, because in traditional publishing, they act as they do work on your manuscript, but they also act as your project manager and your friend, and because they help you from the beginning all the way when you've acquired your book, all the way to the end and beyond. And so once you've found the physical copies in your hand, and all the way to, because the public books journey doesn't finish when you've got physical copies in your hand. But with indie and partnership publishing as well, that the working with an editor is just as useful, as they provide you feedback to help you do your best work. So I've had some kind of indie authors argue that they don't really see the point in an editor, and they'd rather spend their budget elsewhere because they think, well, can't spell check do that for me? And when apart from being mildly offended and moving very swiftly on, an editor can be so much more than that, and I'll tell you why. But first, a little bit more about myself. So I joined the publishing industry in 2015, and I started with a self-publishing company before moving to Penguin Random House, where I've worked on the best-selling titles in non-fiction from Tim Peake, the astronaut, David Jason, the actor, the late Dame Vera Lynn, as well as on fiction titles for thriller writers such as Candice Fox, Heidi Perks, and Gilly Macmillan. All lovely and brilliant authors. And I was there until about 2 years ago, when we're talking about courage, as Brenda was saying. I took the leap and went freelance, and also traveled like basically halfway across the world and moved to Australia for a year. Brave. And then so now I freelance, and I've been doing that ever since, and I specialise in crime, suspense, and thriller fiction. I still work with some of the big publishers, but the best part of my job is working with excited and motivated authors like yourselves to help make your manuscript the best it can be. But enough about me, because I'm assuming that the majority of you are here because you want to write a book or thinking about writing a book. And I'm sure the majority of you would love the idea of being traditionally published and being handed a lovely fat advance on a plate, which I would too, if that was offered to me too. But alas, publishing has changed so dramatically in the past few years, with technology, infrastructure, culture, and even the pandemic affecting how the published book world has been working. And so now it's even harder than ever to get noticed by acquiring editors and agents. Therefore, it's so important to make sure your manuscript is as strong as possible when you're sending it out into the world. There's a literary agent called Stephen Laub, who who commented once that if he gets a submission that's 90% of the way to a sellable manuscript, he'll take it over the line for them. But if it's only 80% of the way, he'll reject it, which is a slightly terrifying margin of error, but it's not meant to scare you, but inform you and motivate you to put your best foot forward. And the best person who can help you with pushing yourself to that 90% is an editor, and here's why. Just as a short aside, the following information is applicable to both non-fiction and fiction editing, manuscript writing even though I do specialise in fiction. So it doesn't matter whether you're writing a self-help book, your memoirs, children's novel, or a trilogy fantasy fiction series, it's all applicable. So here we go. So I guess writing is often considered a relatively isolating experience because it's just you, the pen, paper, keyboard, and you're often working on a single project for a couple of months, if not years, if not decades, which is great for creativity, but it often results in a problem that the author has been working on the manuscript for so long that they can no longer see the wood for the trees. They just know their manuscript too well. And this is when an editor is a godsend because they act as a fresh pair of eyes, seeing the manuscript from a different point of view and providing insight that you as an author just won't be able to see because you're simply too close to the text. Because if you think about it, editing, another word for editing is revision. And if you break that up, revision into revision means seeing again. Which kind of leads me on to my second important point of the importance of an editor, is that no author, no matter how much they try, can ever be objective about their own work. They'll always have bits they favour or parts that they know is a bit dodgy, but they're trying to ignore it. And they kind of, so for example, I'm sure you've all heard of the concept in writing called kill your darlings, which is basically the bit that you've worked hardest and absolutely love is most likely the bit that you need to cut first. Because revision is hard, but it's so much easier when you've got an objective editor to kind of point you in the right direction and suggesting whether you should cut those 3 chapters that you tried to sneak in, or that anecdote that you thought was hilarious but isn't quite coming across that way. So I guess that's why some authors are a bit hesitant about working with an editor, because sending your work to someone you don't know is quite terrifying. And Brenda was talking about courage earlier. It's easier to ask your friends and family because for the most part, you hope they don't want to offend your feelings. But with a stranger or a relative stranger, it's a bit more of a gamble. So that you might be thinking, oh, what if they hate it? What if they think it's rubbish? Or what if they tell me to start again? And in the spirit of honesty, not all feedback you're going to get from an editor will be positive. But then again, that's their job. If their job is to point out places where you can improve, and if an editor came back and say it's absolutely perfect, you'd probably be sitting going, well, that wasn't really worth the money, was it? Or you might be, or it wouldn't really serve the purpose either, because it'd just be ego stroking, which is nice, but not really very helpful. But then again, also, that might sound scary, but all editors are aware of the privilege of their position, because writing is quite an intimate process, and they're aware that it's an honor to be invited to work on something like that. So although they might point out weaknesses in your current text, they'll also tell you your strengths. So in a way, an editor also acts as a vote of confidence, your kind of personal cheerleader, to cheer you on when you're doubting yourself, or when trying to reaffirm your goals, your vision, when you have those wobbly moments, because we all have the wobbly moments, and give you a push when you need it, with editorial advice on how to reach your goal. And I guess that leads on to another key point of having a professional look at your manuscript rather than your immediate circle, because not only do you get objective advice, you'll also be on the receiving end of years worth of experience, which is vital in the competitive book market at the moment. So editors often specialize, and so when you work with them, you'll have their general knowledge of things like structure, grammar, etc., but you'll also have their specialist knowledge of that particular area. So as Brenda mentioned, and I also mentioned, I specialize in crime, suspense and thriller, because I basically can't resist a good mystery, and so I keep up to date with market trends, trade buzz, that sort of thing, so I can transfer that knowledge onto my clients' projects. So, for example, I went to a seminar recently with an agent and a major publisher at one of the big five. I think it was HarperCollins. Yeah. And they were talking about what was trending in crime fiction at the moment. And if there's any crime writers here and who've scribbled away a lockdown-inspired crime thriller, that's a brilliant idea, but you may want to hold it back because the market isn't quite ready yet. A bit too raw. After Boris's announcement yesterday, hopefully we might be in a better place soon enough. But right now, not the best idea. And so if you have that that sort of knowledge, you can pass that on to your editor to find out. That means the author has more space to focus on what really matters, which is the story, your vision, your message that you want to put across. And some writers often complain that they struggle to finish their manuscript because they're bogged down in the details, through like spelling, grammar. They're kind of obsessed with the character and they're not quite get it right. But if you know you're sending your manuscript to an editor, you can rest easy and concentrate on finishing that story and writing the best story that you can. So you're leaving the details like that to your editor and also later drafts. Because no matter how correct your grammar is, no amount of editing will make a bad book good, which is something you have to bear in mind, because what are agents and authors acquiring editors looking for but a good book? And as we know, it's getting harder and harder to get your book noticed, and it's even harder when you've only got one shot. Because when you send out your manuscript in the world, you only have that one chance to make a first impression. So whether you're submitting to an agent, a publishing house, or self-publishing your own book, you don't want to be judged by typos, poor grammar, plot holes, or clangers left in behind in the manuscript, because you don't want to give them a reason to put that story down. Also, Amazon trolls are evil, so you don't want to be subject to that either. And when you think about it, agents receive thousands of submissions a year, and over probably close to 200,000 books are published each year in the UK, which you then extrapolate to worldwide is over 1 million books a year, which is a lot of competition. Therefore, if an agent or a reader gets the impression that the manuscript is hard to read, doesn't offer the information it's supposed to, or that it's unprofessional, because an unedited manuscript is an unprofessional manuscript, that you basically consider that reader lost, because there's so many books out there in the market, it's really hard to convince them to try again. In this way, you have to put forward your best version of your manuscript first, but also your best version of yourself, because as an author, you are a brand and you have to keep that in mind. And you don't want to tar your name or your reputation with one dodgy manuscript, for example. So you need to make your strongest impression the first time around. You can do this by yourself, but the most crucial part of working with an editor is that it gives you a trial run, because you can send your manuscript off to someone you don't know, who can come back and feedback to you and help you make your manuscript the best it can possibly be when it counts, and increase your chances of reaching your goals. Which is all the reasons why working with an editor is important. But how do you find an editor and how do you work with an editor? So here are some of my top tips. So counterintuitively, before you even consider working with an editor, you need to make sure that you've done as much as you possibly can on the manuscript yourself. Because you think about it, 80% of writing a book is revision. So any author will get the most out of their editing experience if they can send their editor the best possible manuscript that they can. Because rather than highlighting more obvious points that the author would probably pick up themselves on their own revision process, they can then focus in on things that they may not have considered. This can sound daunting, especially to brand new writers who think, oh, I've written my manuscript, but I've no idea where to go now. I finished it, yay, but how do I revise it? How do I make it better? So my first suggestion with this would be give yourself a break. One, you've written a book, you deserve a pat on the back and a holiday. But two, after finishing your draft, step away from it for at least 3 weeks, more if you can, because then you'll have time to distance yourself from the manuscript. You don't have to stop writing. You can keep working on another project if you like, or do some research maybe. But you don't want to be thinking about that particular manuscript, because you, in the back of your mind, your head will be subconsciously working out the things that are niggling to you. And then when you come back to your manuscript, you'll have a fresher approach, and will be able to evaluate your work more critically and revise it far more efficiently. However, when you are reaching the stage where you can do no more yourself, it's time to find an editor. But note, I say reaching the stage or approaching it, because you don't want to leave it too late, because the best editors tend to be booked up months in advance. I personally, I'm booked up until June 2021 at the moment, moving swiftly into, I think, July next week. So if you have an editor that you love, it really pays to query them as early as you possibly can, even just to scout out what their availability is, so you can make sure you work with the editor who you want to work with. And I've lost one of my cards. This is going really well. I can't remember what my other points were. This is great. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 minute, guys, because this is what, here we go. This is what, because this is why we have trial runs and editors, to make sure you don't cock up. Anyway, but you've now decided you want to find an editor and you've queried them, but wait, how do you know which editor is the best for you? So there are some key principles to bear in mind. First of all, what edit do you want? There are many different types of edit, and they kind of break down into 3 categories, which is the developmental or structural editing, which basically answers the question, is this the best way to tell a story or tell your story? The next one is line and copy editing, which focuses in on the words, whether stylistically or correctively. And then proofreading, which is kind of the final polish to make sure your manuscript is as professional as possible. Some authors come to me and go, I don't know which edit I need. So what you should do is have a little sample that you can send over to your editor or to someone you're querying, and they'll be more than happy to recommend the best approach for you. Another thing is, as I mentioned earlier, you need to look for someone who specializes in your genre. You'll get more bang for your buck for this as well with this approach, as they'll bring their genre expertise as well as their technical knowledge. But it's less important if you're only asking for a proofread, in my opinion. But I'd advise, if you're writing fiction, to maybe get a proofreader who specializes in fiction. It may not necessarily have to be your genre, but that'll be useful. But also for non-fiction. So for example, if you're doing something more technical, like a nutrition guide or something that requires a bit more specialist knowledge, having someone who's au fait with non-fiction would probably be a better direction. Thirdly, ask for a sample edit. This is so important, because not only does it allow you to check that the edit that you're being offered is the one that you want before it's too late, but it also allows for you to check that you and the editor are a good fit, because it's important to get not only the right editor for your manuscript, but also for you as an author, because it's such an important process. So don't be afraid to ask about sample edits. It's a standard practice with all editors. If they don't give you an edit, or they say they don't do one, that might be a little red flag to be slightly wary about it. But some editors do charge for a sample edit, and that's not problematic at all. It normally just puts towards your final edit if you decide to go with them. Speaking of money, be upfront and honest about your budget. Editing can seem expensive, especially if you're self-publishing or partnership publishing, and it seems like quite a large investment at the front end of your publishing process. But many editors are understanding of this and can often come up with an approach that suits both your aims and your budget, and work out something that's, or if not, suggest alternative routes for you to help make the most progress with your manuscript. However, if the price does feel too good to be true, it probably is. Publishing is a largely unregulated industry at the moment, and there are some brilliant people out there, lovely, like the book Brilliance team or a number of other publishers, and I think everyone who's featured on the Voice and Pen previous seminars. but there are some dodgy characters out there, so do your research. And if you're not sure about it, seek the advice of professionals like Brilliance and the Chartered Institute of Editors and Proofreaders, or the Society of Authors, or the Alliance of Independent Authors. They're all great bodies. Another tip I have is always get multiple quotes from different people. They'll have different advice. And also then if you find one that's a bit of an anomaly, you'll go, phew, I avoided the slightly dodgy one there. So that's also really helpful. And then my final tip, when you do find an editor, send them the cleanest manuscript you possibly can. It doesn't have to be error-free, but if you're not even bothered to run a simple spell check or something like that, not only does it come across as you're not particularly serious about your manuscript, but you're also disadvantaging yourself, as your editor will then have to wade through these errors, and they'll be too busy with that, dealing with these muddied waters, that they might find it more difficult to provide you with actionable and clear advice that you're looking after. And don't forget your editor. Actually, this leads into my next point. Your editor is human too. They aren't the Microsoft spell check. So as much there is with any editor, there's no guarantee a manuscript will be error-free, but if you look at your revisions at the end and you'll see 4,000 amends versus the one typo that might appear at the end, you'll know it's definitely worth the investment. As I said, working with an editor is an incredibly rewarding experience, and it can transform your manuscript from merely good to great and even better and even beyond that. But the main draw of working with an editor is that it's a long-term investment, because that benefit isn't restricted to the one manuscript. Working with an editor will improve your writing skill. So with you have the feedback from your first edit, you can then extrapolate that on to your next manuscript and your next manuscript, because there's nothing more rewarding for an editor than seeing their author improve. And the biggest irony of being a book editor is that a sign of a job well done is that your author needs you less and less. So yeah, that's why I think editing is incredibly important. And are we doing questions now, Brenda, or will it be later? Now, questions, the floor.
Give Rebecca a huge round of applause. That was jam-packed there, Rebecca. Thank you so much. Lots of little gems in there. So I'm sure you must have burning questions about editing, and we've got one of the best editors here. So if you've got any questions, please fire away.
Rebecca, hi, Sat here.
Oh, hello.
You're right. Sorry, I'm not got my video on. I'm just tied up in the middle of other things as well. But quick question, because when I did my book, I went through an editor and then my publishing house edited it as well. Would you say the more sort of it's beneficial sort of having your book edited by different people, or just stick to the one? Because in that sense, sort of not have like two editors in the same level, but kind of like if you're, say, going through a publishing house, you have a personal editor first and they sort of look through it and do their editing, but then you obviously take it to the publishing house. Does that give you a good chance, do you think?
I think it depends. It depends how experienced you are as a writer. If it's your first, I think it would be useful to not necessarily have a full edit, but maybe just a sort of smaller, maybe like an assessment or some sort of feedback to see whether you're heading in the right direction. Because if you're going to publish with a manuscript or you're submitting to a publisher, as I said before, you want to make that best impression and you only have one chance to do it. So you want to make sure that when you're sending that submission in, that your vision is clear and that the message that you're trying to convey makes sense. So if you have the budget to do that, it would be very useful to just send it up to, if you could send it to a stranger and they say, yes, I can see what you're doing and I understand the motivation and what you want to do. Perfect, because then you know you're on the right track.
Right.
And so that's very useful. I wouldn't suggest any editing before, if you were doing a if you are hoping to publish traditionally, I would suggest it would be more of the sort of the bigger edits, the developmental edits, because they're looking to acquire a good story. Whereas if you don't necessarily need to go further down the line with more corrective edits, because that'll be taken in-house. Because you've got to bear in mind that when you are acquired by either an agent or a publishing house, sometimes they have their own amends that they might want to make. So you don't want to do yourself a disservice by having the whole manuscript like copy edited and proofread to basically publication standards, and then the acquiring editor might come and go, I love this, but you might want to chop this bit, and you're like, oh, I've done all that work in that manuscript. So I think before that, it's about making sure your vision is clear, your story is correct, and basically you nail that story.
Right, thanks.
Thanks a lot, Rebecca. Another question, Dexter?
Yes, Rebecca, fascinating information, thank you. In terms of the manuscript, is there a particular typeface, size and spacing that you would recommend?
With a lot of editors nowadays, they will ask for the manuscript in a computer file, so you don't necessarily need to worry about the font, etc., as much, because they might change it themselves to make sure. They'll have different preferences for different people to read. But as a kind of a rule of thumb, if you can send over something that maybe about size 12, double spaced is helpful, because it allows people to read more easily. And if some editors who do still edit on paper, it's easier for them to write notes if it's double spaced. It's also just easier on the eye. No weird fonts. Weird fonts are unhelpful. So like bright green and that sort of stuff. You've got to think, if you've got an 100,000 word manuscript, that's 300 pages. And I'm already wearing thick glasses. I don't need to get any thicker. But yeah, that would be very useful. Of course, that if that's in relation to submitting to an agency or a publisher, make sure you follow their guidelines, because they'll be different. That each publisher might have different how much they require or what they are expecting from you. So you don't want to fall at that fence because you've just assumed it's all the same. So make sure you do your due diligence, but it doesn't matter too much, I don't think.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
One more question and then we'll go into breakout rooms. Mandy?
Yeah, sorry, I dropped something and it made a noise. I missed part of Dexter's answer from Rebecca. Did I miss the part that said, does it matter which format it's in? I got the size and the font and the spacing. I heard the other day that somebody said, oh, people don't like Word.
I'm going to contradict you there, because Word is the kind of industry standard. Microsoft Word is the industry standard. Yeah, I know. I in fact if someone sends me a Mac Pages document or something like that, then I'm more like, oh god, because most editors work with Microsoft Word track changes, which allows you to see the back and forth. And so you can do that on Google Documents and stuff. I mean, if you have a particular preference for a program, like obviously mention that at the beginning, but I'm not sure. I know there's ways you can get Microsoft Office that's not too expensive. So if you think about it, I'm not sure if there's an Office 365. I don't know. It's software. Yeah, that's it basically. So that works with track changes and stuff. So it really is the industry standard. It's kind of what expected from most editors.
Thank you. That's a huge relief. Thank you.
So that's perfectly fine.
Thanks a lot.